Hello, and welcome to Red Clover's Fanfic Theater. Now, if you are wondering what this is about, at a few of the gaming conventions I've attended, there have been panels where people have done dramatic readings of bad fanfiction. That's all well and good, but having done some previous story recordings, I thought, why not highlight some of the good fanfiction I've found? And so, here's a short fanfic that I discovered a number of years ago. I must warn you, this is not meant for kids. It probably warrants a PG-13 rating. The link's in the description if you'd like to read it. Anyway, without further delay, I present Shadows, a Shadow Hearts Covenant story by SilverLocke980. Sometime after this letter was written, in a small journal Karen kept with her always, as her way of writing down any interesting events that happened to her on her trip with Yuri, the final battle was waged. Once it was over, each went to their separate heavens, and Yuri was found wandering, with no memory, in Wales. Each went off to a separate land. Each created, almost by accident, a new world born from the old. But Karen alone was not allowed to have a new land. Karen went back in time to the moment when she was destined to meet Jinpachiro Hyuga and fall in love with him. Jinpachiro never told anyone, but the red-headed, beautiful Russian woman was one of the most bitter people he had ever met. It was her beauty alone that let her win over Jinpachiro, and though they were often making love in the earliest parts of the relationship, after Yuri's birth his wife almost totally withdrew into herself. It has been said by a nurse who was there that she broke down into sobbing laughter when she named him Yuri in the hospital. It had been a name that Jinpachiro had heard his wife speak in her sleep, beside him, as she stirred in his arms and moved against him, suddenly tensing, suddenly snarling into the night. He never knew why. Soon enough, the fateful trip to China occurred, and Karen, wanting to preserve one of the few memories she could think of that made her smile, the day she talked with Yuri in Nihonbashi, said nothing, merely watching as little Yuri listened to the sounds of the ship. She thought she'd cry on the trip. Jinpachiro, who did love Karen in a way, merely assumed she was sad that they were leaving Japan. He never said anything either. Because of this, Yuri did remember the sound of the ship in the water leaving for China, for the simple reason that it was the only thing he could listen to. Nobody was talking on that trip. Karen stayed in China, moving around as her husband performed missions and gradually grew into a silent, powerful, noble man. Karen never did love Jinpachiro, but in the end, she saw him for the nobility that he was, and forgave him. After all, he had nothing to do with it. Fate, on the other hand, did. Karen watched, and the odd fact that her memories were actually the future and she was living in the past gave her unusual insight into the way things worked. Jinpachiro, for instance, once went off on a mission and came back with an unusual perfume smell about him. Karen, eyes lighting up with sudden knowledge that came to her like a gunshot, suddenly saw all the fate strands lighting up at once. The perfume was Italian. It was called Man Maria, and Lucia had been particularly fond of it on their trip, often wearing it when they were traveling to different villages in hopes of enticing straight men, or annoying gay ones. Lucia was very fond of bothering the Majimil brothers when they met, which for some reason was still one of the funniest things Karen remembered from her original journey. Karen remembered it, and when she saw the way Jinpachiro was acting, she knew something was up. She quietly wrote down in her journal that she thought that, though she couldn't be sure, there was too much involved, it was too much damn coincidence. But she thought that Jinpachiro Hyuga was Lucia's father. For some reason, she could just see it. A spice vendor coming up the Silk Road, entering China, Jinpachiro meeting her, being enticed by her beauty, probably tired from all the things he had to kill, just meeting up with her for one night of pleasure in a land of setting suns and forever stretching rice paddies. And boom. Years later, Karen meets up with Lucia, daughter of her husband, bastard child produced by the man she had married for the sole sake of producing her loved one. And, of course, Lucia entrances her own half-brother at their first meeting without realizing it. Fate was cruel, fate was malicious, and fate was perverted. It was in that moment Karen was freed. With the revelation from Good that fate was nothing more than an old pervert sitting on a bag of bones and playing with himself, Karen realized that she could fight her own fate. And fight it she did. She'd lost her swords years ago, but in the half year since the revelation that Jinpachira was Lucia's father and that fate was nothing more or less than the devil so much of the world hated, Erin practiced and trained in the combat styles she'd seen her husband use, finally managing to get a cheap Chinese combat sword from a local vendor. She never could do Sonnenstocke again, but Feuerwerk and Brennvogel came easily enough to her, and even Gespenst was not entirely beyond her reach. She thought she could fight. She was wrong. When the demons came, she immediately knew there were too many of them. Oh man, there were hundreds of the things out there, but she resolved to die fighting anyway. Since she knew, or thought she knew, that her son would take care of them by himself, she decided to focus solely on pounding the ugliest demons herself. She wanted to be the last thing the worst of them ever saw. And she was. Mostly. Unbeknownst to her, if Karen had not fought as fiercely as she had, Yuri would have died there too. His powers, fueled on rage and the mad perfection of childhood, of innocence, gave him the ability to slaughter the demons quickly and easily, but if the strongest of them had lived, they would have killed him. As it was, Karen died, saving Yuri's life one last time. The crazy thing was, it wasn't the end of her story. Karen lived on, her spirit born into time by the will of God to live on, because it was not yet her time. When she prayed in the dark of the night that she be given one more chance, she had no idea someone was listening, and when he heard her, he answered. 50 years passed before her spirit came back into the real world again. When it did, it found itself in the hands of a young woman from Italy named Vera, who had taken up an amazingly beautiful sword she'd found outside her small house and had been admiring it when Karen's gruff, grouchy voice echoed in her ears. Rather bemused to have become a spirit, Karen stepped back into time, found a way to transmit her essence from the sword to other objects, and by possessing a doll the still-living Roger Bacon made for her, joined Vera on a quest to save the world. And this time, she got to be the leader. Fate weaves its strands and plays its games. Unfortunately for it, God happens to be on the side of good, and not the world. The world itself matters not. It's the heroes inside it who matter most. And when Karen finally died, when her puppet finally let go, her first words to Yuri were, "Hey, asshole. It's been a while, huh?"